They had always whispered about her limp long before the wedding day ever arrived, long before the white dress, long before the bells and flowers and polished wooden pews, because in a town that thrived on perfection, weakness was treated like a public crime, and Eliza Moore had been found guilty since the age of 12, the day a drunk driver ran a red light and shattered her leg, her future, and the way people looked at her forever, leaving her with a slow, uneven step that no surgery could completely erase. And while she learned how to walk again through pain that burned like fire in her bones, the town learned how to look past her eyes and see only the flaw, the limp, the inconvenience of her existence. So when the news spread that she was getting married, to him, of all people, there was laughter behind hands, disbelief behind smiles, and cruel bets whispered in corners about how far she'd make it down the aisle before falling, because the groom, Daniel Hawthorne, was everything. Eliza was not in their eyes, strong, successful, calm, a man whose presence filled rooms without effort, a man who could have chosen anyone, and yet he chose her, the girl who walked like she was always fighting gravity, the girl who never complained, never defended herself, never asked the world to be kind. And on the morning of the wedding, as sunlight spilled through the church windows and music swelled softly, Eliza stood at the back, gripping her bouquet not from nerves but from habit. Because pain had a way of reminding her it was still there when she stood too long, and the moment the doors opened, she felt it, the weight of eyes, the sharp sting of judgment, the silent countdown waiting for her to stumble, and as she took her first step, then another, the limp showed itself like it always did, subtle but undeniable, and the murmurs began, not loud enough to stop her, but loud enough to wound, people shifting, leaning, exchanging glances that said this is a mistake, this won't last. Why would he tie himself to someone broken? And every step felt heavier than the last, not because of her leg, but because of the shame they tried to place on her shoulders, and yet she walked, slower than tradition allowed, slower than impatience liked, but steady, determined, her eyes fixed forward on the man waiting at the altar, the only face in the room that did not change, did not judge, did not flinch, because Daniel saw none of what they saw. He saw the girl who laughed with her whole heart, the woman who learned resilience before romance, the soul who taught him that strength was not loud or flawless. And when Eliza's leg finally trembled, when pain flared sharp enough that her breath caught and her steps faltered, the room tensed, waiting for the fall they had predicted, but instead, something else happened. Daniel stepped forward, breaking tradition, breaking silence, breaking every expectation in that room, and before anyone could react, he was beside her, one hand steady at her waist, the other gently lifting her bouquet away, and in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear, he said, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." And then, as gasps rippled through the church, he bent down, lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, as if carrying her was the most natural thing in the world, and Eliza clutched his shoulders, tears blurring her vision, not from embarrassment, but from relief, from love, from the sudden realization that she was no longer walking alone. And as he carried her the rest of the way down the aisle, step by deliberate step, the whispers died, replaced by a silence so heavy it forced reflection, because in that moment, the town witnessed something they had never respected before: devotion without pride, love without conditions, strength that chose gentleness over appearance. And if you're feeling this moment, the photographs from that day would later circulate through the town, frozen moments of a groom carrying his bride with a calm smile, her face buried against his neck, tears caught halfway between sorrow and joy. And while some would call it dramatic, others would call it romantic, only a few understood the truth, that Daniel wasn't making a statement, he was keeping a promise he had made long before the wedding, a promise he first whispered in a hospital room years earlier when Eliza apologized for limping beside him, when she asked, half joking and half broken, if he minded walking slower, and he had replied without hesitation, "Then I'll slow down." And now, standing at the altar with her in his arms, he felt the full weight of that promise, not as a burden but as an honor, because loving Eliza had never been about saving her, it had been about standing with her when the world refused to. And as the ceremony continued with her seated beside him instead of standing, their hands entwined, the officiant's words seemed to echo differently, speaking not just of sickness and health, but of choice, daily, deliberate choice. And when Daniel said his vows, he didn't speak of perfection or ease, he spoke of mornings when pain would return, of nights when the world would be unkind, of steps they would take together whether fast or slow. And when Eliza spoke, her voice trembling but strong, she thanked him not for carrying her body, but for carrying her dignity when others tried to strip it away. And there were tears then, not just from her, but from the very people who once mocked her, because shame has a way of arriving late but heavy. And after the ceremony, when Daniel carried her again, this time out of the church, laughter replacing silence, someone finally asked him if it was hard, if it scared him to commit to a life that wouldn't always be easy, and he answered simply, easy was never the goal. And in the weeks that followed, the story changed in the telling, no longer about the limp, no longer about the mockery, but about a groom who carried his bride because love demanded it, and Eliza noticed the difference too, not in how her leg felt, but in how she was seen. Children no longer stared, adults no longer whispered, and though the limp remained, its power over her life began to fade, because she had learned something crucial, that dignity is not granted by crowds, it is protected by those who love you fiercely. And years later, when their own daughter asked why Mommy walked differently, Daniel lifted the child gently and said, because she's strong in a way most people never learn. And Eliza smiled, knowing that strength didn't always look like standing tall, sometimes it looked like trusting someone enough to let them carry you. Marriage did not quiet the world the way Eliza secretly hoped it might, because while vows could silence a church, they could not instantly erase years of judgment, and the moment the wedding glow faded into ordinary mornings, reality returned with familiar cruelty, subtle at first, then sharper, as neighbors smiled politely but questioned Daniel in private about his sacrifice, about whether he had truly understood what he was signing up for, whether carrying her down the aisle had been a beautiful gesture or the beginning of a lifetime burden. And Daniel listened without anger, without defense, because he had learned that love did not require explanation to those unwilling to understand. But Eliza heard the echoes anyway, in the way job interviews stalled when employers noticed her limp, in the way invitations became fewer, in the way strangers still stared when they walked hand in hand through town, and some nights, when pain crept into her leg like a slow-burning fire and sleep refused to come, she would turn her face away from Daniel, ashamed of the quiet tears she didn't want him to see, afraid that one day, no matter how strong his love was, the weight of her limitations might finally press too hard. But Daniel always noticed, always reached for her hand in the dark, reminding her without words that love was not a performance measured on good days alone. And the true test came one autumn evening when Daniel was offered a prestigious position in the city, a job that promised influence, respect, and escape from the small-town whispers, but it also demanded long hours, relentless travel, and a pace Eliza knew she could not always keep. And when Daniel came home with the letter in his hand, excitement shadowed by concern, Eliza forced a smile and told him he should take it, told him she would manage, told him love should not chain him to her struggles. And Daniel listened, quietly, before placing the letter on the table and saying words that would later become the cornerstone of their marriage. I didn't choose you because life would be simple, I chose you because life would be real. And with that, he declined the offer, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. And yet the world did not reward that choice, because months later, when Daniel injured his shoulder saving a ranch hand from a falling beam, suddenly it was him who struggled, him who moved slower, him who faced doubt and pity. And Eliza watched the shift with painful awareness as the same people who once admired Daniel's strength now questioned his usefulness. And in that reversal, something fierce awakened inside her, because love had taught her courage. And when Daniel tried to hide his frustration, his fear of becoming a liability, Eliza became the one who steadied him, who reminded him that worth was not measured in speed or strength, that love did not keep score. And one morning, as Daniel struggled to button his shirt with one hand, Eliza knelt, not to be helped, but to help, and tied his boots with the same care he once used to carry her. And in that quiet moment, the truth crystallized. Love was not about who carried whom, but about never letting the other fall alone. And as the town watched this couple weather hardship without bitterness, something began to change, not dramatically, not loudly, but honestly, because example has a way of reshaping judgment. The town's reckoning did not arrive with apology cards or grand speeches, because guilt rarely announces itself loudly. Instead it crept in through small moments that stacked upon each other until denial became impossible. And Eliza felt it first in the way people now paused to hold doors open without sighing, in the way shopkeepers no longer rushed her along, in the way children began asking curious questions instead of cruel ones. Because watching her and Daniel endure hardship together had slowly dismantled the stories the town once told itself about strength and worth. And the turning point came the winter the river flooded, swallowing roads, barns, and livelihoods in a single violent night, when sirens wailed and panic spread faster than the water itself. And Daniel, still recovering but stubborn as ever, organized rescue efforts with one good arm and sheer determination, while Eliza, refusing to be sidelined, transformed their home into a relief center, coordinating supplies, calming frightened families, remembering names when others only saw numbers. And when the power went out and fear pressed in heavy, it was Eliza's steady voice that cut through the darkness, guiding people with patience learned from years of being overlooked. And when an elderly woman slipped on wet ground and cried out in pain, it was Eliza, limp and all, who reached her first, bracing herself, refusing help, refusing to let someone else feel abandoned the way she once had. And the image of her standing there, soaked, shaking, yet unyielding, burned itself into the town's memory, because for the first time, they were not watching a woman defined by what she lacked, but by what she gave. and after the floodwaters receded and normal life staggered back into place, something else receded too, the arrogance of judgment, and at the town meeting held to thank volunteers, the mayor faltered through rehearsed words before finally setting the paper aside and admitting, voice thick, that they had been wrong about many things, about many people, and though he never said her name directly, every eye turned toward Eliza and Daniel, and in that silence, heavier than applause, Eliza felt something loosen inside her chest, not triumph, not revenge, but release, because forgiveness arrived quietly, not as a gift to those who wronged her, but as freedom for herself, and later, as Daniel and Eliza walked home under streetlights reflected in puddles, Daniel offered to carry her when pain slowed her steps, but she shook her head with a smile and said, "Not tonight," because strength had taken on a new shape for her, one that allowed choice instead of survival, and hand in hand, they walked at their own pace through a town that finally learned humility, and if this chapter speaks to you, time did what judgment never could. It softened the sharpest edges of the past and revealed truths that spectacle alone could not hold, and in the years that followed the flood, Eliza and Daniel settled into a life that no longer felt like a battle to be justified, but a rhythm shaped by patience, laughter, and the steady work of loving each other in ordinary moments, the kind of moments no one applauds yet everything depends on. And when Eliza discovered she was pregnant, fear arrived before joy, because her body had taught her caution, and the whispers of risk and limitation returned uninvited, but Daniel met that fear the way he always had, without panic, without denial, only with presence, and when their daughter was born, small and fierce and perfect, Eliza wept not because of pain, but because the world had given her something she never believed she was allowed to have, and raising a child did not erase hardship, it reframed it, because sleepless nights amplified aches, and worry found new shapes, yet joy arrived just as persistently, in first steps taken with wobble and determination, in bedtime stories where Eliza's voice became a safe place, and as their daughter grew old enough to notice her mother's limp, she asked one afternoon if it hurt, and Eliza answered honestly, sometimes, and the child nodded with the seriousness only children possess and replied, "Then I'll walk slower with you," a sentence so simple it carried the weight of generations of misunderstanding finally set right, and the town watched again, this time not as critics but as witnesses, because Eliza was no longer an exception to pity, she was an example of quiet strength, volunteering at the school, mentoring girls who believed their bodies disqualified them from dreams, teaching them that limitation was not the absence of worth but the birthplace of empathy, and Daniel, older now, shoulder-heeled but spirit-marked by experience, often stood at the edge of rooms watching his wife speak, knowing that the woman once mocked for struggling down an aisle now carried others forward with words and compassion, and the legacy they built was not carved into buildings or headlines, but into people, into changed perspectives, into children who learned early that love adapts instead of abandoning. And if this chapter resonates with you, years later, the church that had once witnessed whispers and judgment now hosted a celebration not of pomp, but of life fully lived, and Eliza stood at the entrance again, not as a bride this time, but as a mother, a mentor, a woman whose limp had long stopped being a weakness and instead became a symbol of courage, because she had learned that every step mattered less than the meaning behind it, and as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle toward her own wedding, tiny hands clutching a bouquet that mirrored the one Eliza once held, tears gathered in her eyes, not of fear, not of shame, but of awe at how far life had come, and Daniel, standing beside her, now grayer at the temples but just as steady and unshakable, whispered softly, "We made it," and she smiled through tears. Nodding, remembering the day he had lifted her when the world expected her to fall, remembering every trial, every laugh, every tear, every night she had thought she couldn't go on, every day he had proven love was stronger than mockery, stronger than pain, stronger than fear itself, and as their daughter approached, taking her first steps in front of an audience that included the very same townspeople who had once doubted, Eliza's heart swelled, because she realized something profound, the journey they had walked, the slow steps, the carried moments, the shared burdens, had not only changed them, it had reshaped an entire community's understanding of strength, worth, and love. And when Daniel offered to walk their daughter down the aisle, the girl, bold and confident, shook her head and laughed, "I can do it myself, Papa," and in that instant, Eliza understood that love, like courage, multiplies when shared, and the crowd erupted not in mockery this time, but in tears, applause, and heartfelt respect, and the lesson was clear, dignity is not given, it is preserved through care, patience, and unwavering devotion, and as they watched the bride reach the altar with a steady step, Daniel gently resting his hand over Eliza's in quiet celebration, the church seemed to exhale a collective understanding that some stories aren't just about weddings or limps or appearances, they are about choosing each other when the world refuses to, about carrying one another without hesitation, about the quiet victories that echo louder than ridicule. And if this story has touched you,